Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Marc Rosenblum. I'm the Deputy Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program here at the Migration Policy Institute. Thank you for joining our webinar today on Reception and Reintegration Services in Central America, ending the Deportee Revolving Door. We have two presenters for you today. We'll hear first from Victoria Rietig, a policy analyst here at the Migration Policy Institute on our international program. And we'll also hear from Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas, who's a consultant to MPI's Regional Migration Study Group. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to remind you that the audio and PowerPoint from today's webinar will be on our website later today at the address you see there on your website. The report, Stopping the Revolving Door, Reception and Reintegration Services for Central American Deportees, is also available on our website, and you can go to that bit.ly link right there to download it. If you have any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. The best browsers for watching the webinar are Google Chrome or Firefox. And if you have problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call-in information that we sent you via your email. We will have a Q&A at the end of the call. It won't be a voice Q&A. It'll just be by questions that you submit. So please type in any questions into the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Send them to the host, Lisa. You can send them at any time during the presentation, and then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Or you can also email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. I'm sure everyone on this call is very well aware of the significant surge in Central American children and families arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border last summer. The surge ended last fall just as abruptly as it started, but as Rodrigo will discuss shortly, the numbers of arrivals have once again increased quite substantially in the last 6 months, and there's no question that the flow of asylum seekers from Central America to the United States remains a major challenge. And I'd say it's likely to reemerge as an issue in Congress and in next year's political campaigns. MPI has produced a series of excellent research on this issue, including an overarching report last spring and reports on the U.S. in-country processing program, on Mexico's role in the regional immigration enforcement system, and on how Central American children are faring in U.S. communities. I'd encourage you to go to our website and click on Central America and the Caribbean under the Research and Initiatives tab to review this earlier work. Today's report is a very important addition to this research, focusing attention and analysis on what happens to children and adults who are deported back to Central America. One reason this topic is important is the sheer volume of deportations to the region, well over 100,000 deportations per year each of the last 5 years, including a growing volume of children, along with additional flows of people returning of their own volition. One statistic I think is especially important: the United States has deported over 250,000 convicted criminals to the Northern Triangle countries between 1993 and 2013. And that number includes some repeat cases, but still a huge number. How these deportees do in Central America is a critical question for the success of the region, and how many of these deportees return illegally to the United States versus making a go of it in Central America is a critical question for the success of U.S. immigration policy. So that's really, the background for what we're looking at today, and I'm going to pass it over to Victoria for the details.
Thank you very much, Marc, for the introductory remarks. So in a moment, Rodrigo will start out this presentation by giving us some context and some data about deportations from the United States and Mexico to the Northern Triangle. So we all get a sense of just how many adults and children have arrived as deportees in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in the last years, and also how apprehension trends of unaccompanied children and families have changed in recent months. Marc just mentioned that already. Rodrigo will also give our estimates of how frequent this revolving door phenomenon is of migration, deportation, and remigration, and he will describe the main types of reception and reintegration services that our research has found. I will then take over for the last parts of the presentation and analyze the main common challenges that these services face, and I will talk about recommendations to address them in the future. All the information that we will cover and you will see today, you can also read in our report, Stopping the Revolving Door. This presentation highlights a few select programs that we found, but you can find the full overview and detailed descriptions of the really dozens of programs and services in the report, and to make it easy to skim, we divided the programs by country, and we also give summary tables to facilitate comparison. And with this, I hand it over to Rodrigo.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So I will start by providing some context to better understand the relevance of this issue and the currency of this issue. Mexico and the United States have strengthened their immigration enforcement capacities in the past 5 years, and they have strengthened them quite considerably. This has resulted in increasing numbers of deportations of citizens from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. As you can see in the figure, total deportations to the countries of the Northern Triangle increased from less than 150,000 in 2010 to over 200,000 in 2014, which represents a 50% increase. Between 2010 and 2014, the United States and Mexico have deported over 800,000 people to the countries of the Northern Triangle. Deportations of children, however, have increased particularly quickly, as Marc mentioned in the introduction. Between 2010 and 2014, the number of children deported by Mexico and the United States to the Northern Triangle more than tripled, from around 503,000 to more than 17,000 in 2014. In total, more than 40,000 children deportees from the U.S. and Mexico arrived in the Northern Triangle between these years, and the vast majority of Central American children arriving to their home countries are deported by Mexico. While the flows of unaccompanied children dropped significantly compared to 2014 levels, the most recent data that we have shows a noteworthy uptick of unaccompanied children and family units arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border. So the figure that you have in front of you right now shows apprehensions of unaccompanied children in the blue line and family units in the red line at the U.S.-Mexico border. And you can see that these trends going back from November 2013 all the way to now, November 2015. The large spike in the middle is a famous surge in the summer of 2014 that Marc just mentioned. But after a set of policies including increased enforcement efforts by all the countries in the region, so the U.S., Mexico, and Central America, as well as major public awareness campaigns to counter misinformation about U.S. immigration policy, apprehensions of both unaccompanied children and family units declined sharply, and you can see that very clearly in the chart. But if you look at the extreme right of the chart, we are seeing a new increasing trend in apprehensions of both of these groups. Just 2 months into the new fiscal year, the fiscal year 2016, UAC apprehensions at the U.S.-Mexico border have already reached 10,500, which is more than twice the number compared to the exact same period last year. The number of families has surged even faster. So we have seen that the U.S. and Mexico combined have conducted over 800,000 deportations of Central American migrants. Out of those, over 40,000 were children deportations. These large numbers of people are returning to the same or worse situations that they try to escape in the first place. And many times they have little choice but to try to make another attempt to reach the U.S. But how big is this revolving door phenomenon of migration, deportation, and remigration? Well, we don't know for certain, mostly because most of the data that the U.S. and Mexico collect on migrants does not track individuals. It tracks, migration cases. However, we do have strong indication that this phenomenon is not uncommon at all. As the figure that you can see in this slide shows, according to the Mexican Migration Southern Border Survey, EMIFSUR in Spanish, more than 55% of Guatemalans, around 45% of Hondurans, and 44% of Salvadorans deported from the United States in 2014 said that they intended to remigrate to the U.S. So it appears that this revolving door phenomenon is quite frequent. Additionally, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement reports that at least 19.7% of all removals in 2014 were of repeat immigration violators. So that's people who were already apprehended by ICE before. And additionally, our interviews and field research also showed that it is common for smugglers to wait around the bus stations on the airports where deportees arrive back in Central America to then offer another trip north to the United States. So to disrupt this revolving door phenomenon, the countries of the Northern Triangle need comprehensive policies and programs to help their deported citizens anchor themselves again back in their home countries. So what programs and policies are in place to reintegrate the large numbers of deportees? Victoria and I did a thorough survey of existing programs, and we found that services for deportees can be classified in 4 different categories based on 2 criteria. First, the duration of the services, which we classified as short-term reception services versus long-term reintegration services. And second, their target population, which is either services for adults or services for children. So let's take a look at each of these 4 types of services. So starting with the reception of adults, what happens when deported adults arrive back in the Northern Triangle? Well, this varies depending whether they're deported from the United States by air or from Mexico by land. If they're deported from the U.S. via air, they are greeted at well-established welcome centers at the airport, run by the national governments, many times in collaboration with civil society and international organizations like the IOM or the UNHCR. If deported by land from Mexico, however, they arrive at centers built close to the land crossings in Honduras and El Salvador. There is currently no reception center for land deportees open in Guatemala. Now, the exact services that each of these adult deportees receives, they vary across centers, but generally they include, being given a snack and water. They're registered by the country's migration agency. Deportees usually fill out a survey about their economic background and to know more about their migration history. They usually receive a free phone call to call someone, a member of their family or anyone they need to call once they arrive back to their home countries. You can see that in the little picture to the bottom left of the slide. That's one of the phone call centers. And they receive, if they choose to, they may have a medical checkup, or they might receive some first aid if they need to. Again, I'm going to point you to the bottom right picture of the slide, and you can see the facilities that exist for medical checkups. And they usually receive a hygiene kit with basic toiletries and maybe bus tickets or transportation subsidies to get to their communities of origin. Deportees from the United States also receive new shoelaces or belts. So you can see that in the picture right in the middle of the slide. And this is because shoelaces and belts are taken away from them by Immigration and Customs Enforcement when they board the plane in the United States. Other reception services may include maybe screening interviews to identify at-risk populations, sometimes some money exchange services, and sometimes also opportunities to learn about some jobs or education programs. All in all, the arrival process reception services can be as quick as 30 minutes, so they're usually very immediate and very fast. How are children received? The vast majority of children, as I mentioned before, arrive by land from Mexico, and they are received in specialized shelters in San Pedro Sula in Honduras, Quetzaltenango in Guatemala, and Salvador in El Salvador. In those shelters, they receive similar services to adults. So in the slide that you have in front of you, you can see that on the left, there's an example of one of the hygiene kits that children receive. And there's also areas for children to play So the bottom right picture is an example of the kinds of toys that are there for the children to play when they're received at these reception centers. Because of the unique needs of children, family reunification services are very important, and they're a very important aspect of the reception of children. Before a child can be released from the center, a family member needs to provide documentation that proves that they are a family member who's related to the child. Also, usually to prevent abuse of children, psychologists and social workers conduct short interviews with the children to assess some kind of trauma, or if there's danger for domestic violence. Children can spend a few nights at the center if their family members cannot come on the day of their arrival, or if it is deemed not in the best interest of the child to return to his or her family in case that social workers identified a case of domestic violence. In these cases, if they stay at the shelter for a longer period of time, social workers will determine a long-term solution, usually in collaboration with the child and the National Child Protection Agency at each country. The quality of child shelters varies from country to country and from shelter to shelter, but since the crisis of 2014, the shelters in all three countries have undergone or are currently undergoing renovations and expansions. So, for instance, the El Edén shelter, which is in San Pedro Sula in Honduras, is currently housed in a temporary facility that is not ideal for children, but the new facility is expected to reopen in early 2016. Now looking at the long-term reintegration services. Reintegration services for adults vary considerably. It is important to emphasize that deportees are a heterogeneous group with very different reintegration needs and skill levels. So just imagine a deportee who has spent 5 years in the United States and has family there, and compare that to someone who just started migrating and was just deported from Mexico just maybe a few weeks ago. These two individuals will require very different kinds of reintegration services and support. The variety of reintegration services that we surveyed reflects part of that heterogeneity in the deportee population. Many reintegration programs provide training or vocational education, usually for low and middle skill jobs like carpentry, hairdressing, and mechanics. Some transition programs sometimes try to bridge the gap between the low education levels of many deportees and the minimum skills required to enter one of these vocational training programs. Other programs focus on connecting returnees to potential employers. Some programs also provide loans and training to start a new business. A unique development is the development of networks of deportees that has begun to emerge. And some of these networks of deportees are actively trying to help more recent deportees to anchor themselves back into their countries. So, for instance, a deportee organization in El Salvador, which is called the Salvadoran Institute of the Migrant, in SAMI, they started an initiative to help deportees build micro-enterprises. Actually, the pictures that you see in this slide are from that initiative in El Salvador, and they're promoting in SAMI and their network, which is called Renaceres. The number of beneficiaries of these services, these reintegration services, are extremely small. Our research found that each program served only between a few dozen and a few hundred deportees at most, compared to the hundreds of thousands of deportees each year. Reintegration services for deported children are different in that where they exist, they often focus on school matriculation and medical or psychological services to assist the child's family situation. Since the majority of deported children are teenagers who might not be wanting to return to school, but rather might want to, contribute to the family income. Sometimes they need to make some money to pay back the smuggler fees. Some initiatives have begun to offer skills training just for teenage deportees. So, for instance, in Nahuala, Guatemala, a training center, which is called Quédate, that means stay in English, opened a few months ago, and they're offering computer classes to deported teenagers. At this same center, Quédate, they're also offering jewelry making workshops. And you can see those the two pictures at the bottom right of the slide were taken at that center, recently opened center, Quédate. Also in Guatemala, there's a place called La Red Cat, which is a deportee network, and they offer cooking classes for deported youth and at-risk youth. You can see the pictures on the left of the slide are the logo and the restaurant of La Red Cat. And just as with the adult population, a very small proportion of the tens of thousands of child deportees receive these longer-term services. So with this, I'll pass it on to Victoria, who will present our findings on the common challenges we found in the different reception and reintegration programs.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Before I move on, just a quick reminder to everyone who has tuned in today. If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the little box that you see in front of you, or you can also send us an email to events@migrationpolicy.org. So please go ahead and send them to us during the presentation. We'll be happy to answer them afterwards. So from what Rodrigo presented, you should have gotten a good idea of what services exist to date. And what I want to talk about now is how well these services are addressing the needs of deportees, focusing on what is missing and what we can do about it. Our research identified 5 challenges that we've encountered in the Northern Triangle. First, there is a gap between reception services for land arrivals and for air arrivals. So land arrivals receive fewer services than air arrivals, and that is particularly true in Guatemala. Second, reintegration services have expanded in recent years, but overall they still remain extremely limited. As Rodrigo said, they've reached a few dozen or 100 deportees, but they remain elusive for the vast majority of these hundreds of thousands of deportees. Funding is very limited, that further complicates it, and many programs depend either in part or entirely on international aid. So the reintegration examples of the initiatives that we mentioned here and that we described in the report are really not available to the majority of deportees. In the cases where reintegration programs exist, they have great difficulty actually finding jobs for deportees and channeling them into employment. They often train them, we found, but then they have trouble placing them afterwards. And in some cases, people seem to be trained in skills for which then there is little demand in their community. And even if they are trained in a profession that is in demand, it's still often difficult then to find a job that pays a living wage. Fourth, nearly all the programs that we found suffer from a lack of transparency and really insufficient data collection, and especially monitoring and evaluation was poor. And that makes, of course, assessing their impact and especially their efficiency very difficult. It's very hard to say how much a funder gets, how much bang for their buck they get. And lastly, we found a lack of communication between programs and service providers. And that is true not just across countries, but even within the same country. So the right hand sometimes seems to know not that well what the left hand is doing, and different initiatives are inventing the wheel separately from each other. Also, it's not on this slide, but it's an important contextual point to mention. Obviously, violence is an all-encompassing hindrance to most public policies in Central America. And it is especially for deportee reintegration that this is a challenge, given that these are vulnerable populations that are particularly vulnerable to gang recruitment and to threats of gangs. So overall, our assessment of the situation today when it comes to reintegration services is pretty bleak. And that brings us to the question, what can we do? So let's look at some of our policy recommendations. Let me first talk about what we can do about the first challenge. So to date, when Guatemalan deportees arrive by land from Mexico, they only can rely on some very limited services that are provided by the Red Cross. But there's really no government-operated infrastructure at the crossing. So as Rodrigo mentioned, many deportees get off the bus and they turn around right away to cross back into Mexico. The situation in Honduras, and that is particularly interesting, the situation used to be similar, but they very recently opened up a new reception center for land deportees. It's located in Omoa, which is close to the Guatemalan border at the northern coast. And interviews with service providers there suggest that remigration rates have dropped significantly since then. So we see a relatively simple fix for this. We recommend that Guatemala start operating a reception center for land deportees in Ticunuman, which is close to the border crossing to Tapachula. And apparently, interviews suggested that a reception center there actually has been built, but it has not started operations for unclear reasons. So there's hope that the new Guatemalan leadership would consider opening this center. More generally, we would recommend that governments continue and deepen their collaboration with current service providers. There are many of them, but especially the National Red Cross chapters and the ICRC have been working in providing reception for a long time. And have played an important role and should continue to do that in the future. The second challenge that I want to discuss, the second challenge that existing reintegration programs reach only a fraction of deportees, obviously that has less easy fixes. So we recommend that governments of the region develop national reintegration policies and task specific governmental units with reintegration. And also, and that's crucial, provide them with realistic funding to fully implement the programs. Because our research found that government units often lack the funds to actually implement their mission. And there are some beginnings of that. For instance, in El Salvador, they've created a special office within the Foreign Ministry that is in charge of reintegration. It's too early, really, to evaluate their work. It was opened in summer 2015, but these are the right directions to think in. Also, we think that service providers should expand their programs. As we said, current programs serve typically a few dozen or 100 deportees, but expanding programs mainly hinges on funding, and international donors will remain crucial for this effort in the future. Governments could also think about modifying existing programs to target the deportee population more specifically, for instance, educational programs, vocational training programs, social development programs more general, and employment programs. And it's important to mention that, of course, there is a policy trade-off here. So, of course, other vulnerable populations in Central America may also be in need of services, and that is a valid concern to point out. But some of the well-designed reintegration services in the region that we have seen already, in fact, do not just target the deportee, but their families and thereby their communities as a whole. And lastly, to expand the geographic reach and societal support of reintegration measures, we recommend federal governments collaborate with municipal governments, civil society, UN organizations, and local businesses. So, in essence, a multi-stakeholder approach. And one good example for such a collaboration is, for instance, a joint initiative by the UN Development Program and the Honduran Association of Municipalities, AMON. They have a pilot project in 3 municipalities in Honduras, providing services to 400 children and their communities. And this project is essentially funded by UNDP, coordinated by the Civil Society or Association of the Municipalities, and then implemented by the governments of the municipalities, who send and contract social workers to do the actual follow-up visits of children and their families. Again, this is a project that is still being piloted, but this multi-stakeholder structure and this connection between federal level and state level may serve as a useful model for others. We also found that initiatives that train deportees and effectively channel graduates into employment are still limited. And a way to address that, workforce development agencies should be or could be involved in the development and provision of skills training. For instance, the Guatemalan Workforce Agency, which is called INTECAP, they provide training courses at the Youth Training Center Quédate in Guatemala that Rodrigo mentioned earlier and we saw pictures of. And in Honduras, the equivalent agency there is called INFOP. They collaborated with the Chamber of Commerce of Tegucigalpa, the CCIT, to offer entrepreneurship training to around 300 deportees. And this project succeeded in helping some of these deportees create small businesses, but we have to point out it's currently not operating, it's pending future funds. Initiatives should also try and find employers before they train deportees to ensure that they can enter employment after training. They could create links with private sector companies who have buy-in into the curricular design and then offer employment after the training. And also, I mentioned that earlier, our interviews showed the skills that were taught in some of the courses to deportees were not in fact demanded by the labor market. So course providers should conduct an assessment of local labor demands first so that more deportees leave these classes not just with a certificate, but with a job. And the last point is more on the societal level. Employers might be skeptical about employing deportees because of the stigma attached to deportation. And fighting cliches about them might decrease this, as, for instance, this poster here to the right is trying to do in Honduras. But this is clearly a long-term societal shift that is needed. Regarding the fourth challenge, nearly all the programs that we reviewed lacked consistent monitoring and evaluation and information about exact numbers of beneficiaries, about how much money they had to implement their programs, about outcomes, and about impacts. Those are all rarely available. We can address this problem in three ways. For instance, funders could make data collection and program evaluation a precondition for the disbursement of funds. Things like collecting beneficiaries' age, their gender, their place of origin, education, employment, and detailed contact information. It sounds very basic, but it's not necessarily done in all the programs. Also, importantly, reintegration programs should conduct follow-up surveys with beneficiaries a few months after they receive a service to assess the outcomes and therefore also have better data about remigration rates. Lastly, these programs should collaborate with independent actors, for instance, academia or research institutions, to evaluate program effectiveness and efficiency, and then, important next step, to make results transparently available to the public. Currently, few programs work with an external evaluator, and often evaluations are not available at all. And in the last area, we found that service providers often do not collaborate or communicate even with similar service providers in other countries, and sometimes we're not even aware of similar projects in the same country. So the recommendations to address this lack of communication are relatively self-explanatory, but they are no less important. There would be a clear benefit from more exchange with other programs and service providers in the same country or across borders, for instance, to share good practices, to decrease duplication of work, to give opportunity to apply for funding together, clearly something that is in the interest of all the organizations we were in touch with. Also, reintegration projects that work with local partners and support the building of deportee networks give projects greater credibility. So in interviews, deportees emphasized how much it had helped them to receive advice from former deportees who had found a footing in their home country again. And good examples of this are deportee networks in Guatemala and El Salvador. Rodrigo mentioned them, La Red Cap in Sami are good examples. But also Kids in Need of Defense, KIND. They work with local partners in Guatemala that are steeped in Maya culture, and they offer one of the most comprehensive reintegration services that our research found, and you can see the details of that in our report. So where does all of this lead us? The main message of this webinar in our report is simply this. Some progress has been made, but a long way remains in slowing down the revolving door. Now, our four key takeaways are, first, short-term reception services and infrastructure have expanded, but they still do not reach all deportees. Expansion currently is ongoing, and it is also necessary, particularly at land border crossings. Second, long-term reintegration services reach a fraction of deportees. Again, a few hundreds or thousands compared to hundreds of thousands of deportees. Expansion is very necessary, especially since initiatives are largely nascent, and financial support by international donors is very likely to remain crucial in the future. And third, when we then think about how to make future reintegration services better, there are some promising elements that our research shows. And among those, I just mentioned them, are local actors working with deportee networks, vastly improved monitoring and evaluation, collaborating with employers to get their buy-in, and simply to increase exchange between what already exists. And the last point is, of course, the big question that we are all left with, which is who is responsible? Obviously, Mexico's role as a main deporting country, especially of children, is growing, but it's important to point out that responsibility is really not in one country only. All the countries of the region have a shared responsibility and, in fact, a big self-interest in functional reintegration systems. So what we need today are genuinely regional approaches to deportation and reintegration that require investment and engagement by all the countries, and that is the Northern Triangle, Mexico, and the United States. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Victoria and Rodrigo. So we've received already several good questions. I'll invite you to continue sending your questions via the Q&A box or the chat box. Send them to the moderator, the host, Lisa. But I will start asking some of the questions that you've already sent. And let me start with, we got several questions about children who are returned to the region after having fled gang violence. So what are the special challenges that these children face? What kinds of services are available to them? And what kinds of humanitarian protections are available to them?
Mm-hmm.
That's for you, I think, Victoria.
Thank you. I'm scribbling. So thank you for the question. It's violence, as I mentioned, of course, is the overarching topic of interest that influences all public policies and particularly reintegration policies. And just to name a few statistics, so we know that homicides in El Salvador have surged recently and are in fact on track to overtake Honduras to make it the country with the highest homicide rates. In Honduras, homicides are especially high in the main sending regions. So when we look at where children are fleeing from and where violence is highest, those places very much overlap, essentially in the northern coast and also at the capital, Tegucigalpa. San Pedro Sula, for instance, has among the highest levels of child homicides also. So these are the type of conditions that children flee, and when they are returned, one problem that they are facing is, of course, that they are targeted again by the same gangs that they fled beforehand. They're also, Rodrigo mentioned that, in a worse situation in that they are indebted to their smuggler now, so they have a definite need to come up with ways to pay the smuggler back. And when you're being targeted by a gang, then one of the likely solutions is to turn around and try again. Another problem, of course, is generalized violence in schools. So when we think about reintegration services for children, we often think, well, getting children back into schools is going to be the solution. But in fact, schools in some of these countries are not safe places. So we really have to be careful with just viewing these solutions as easy. And as I said, violence really is so pervasive that it touches on all these areas. Which services are available when children are in interviews identified to be particularly vulnerable to violence, and that includes also, for instance, domestic violence? Then the child protection agencies try to find a longer-term solution that may, in some cases, entail not sending these kids back to their families. And for instance, we've seen very interesting studies from UNHCR about domestic violence, something that is often a little bit a forgotten issue among the broader violence issue. But domestic violence has been found to be a main driver for child and also for family migration and migration of women. So yes, so then these long-term solutions are considered by the various child protection agencies. In our report, you can find all the names of these agencies and how exactly that is being done. So I won't go into that for now, and I hope that this answered the question.
Sure. Let me just ask a follow-up question that somebody sent, which I think just to give you a chance to be clear on it. Most of the reintegration programs are really focused sort of on economic reintegration and getting into schools and getting job placement rather than humanitarian protection. Is that accurate?
Well, I would say that there are some reintegration programs that definitely focus more on the humanitarian and the psychological impact. For instance, in Honduras, there is an initiative by UNICEF called Retorno a la Alegría, so the return to happiness. And that entails a lot of psychological support through volunteer work and through workshops to work with children. But having said that, that is psychological support, but not necessarily solving the problem of the violence itself.
Yeah, thank you. So let me ask a couple of questions that we've received about the roles of other specific government agencies. One question is about the role of El Salvador's Office of Reintegration, what its mission is and what we know about the work that it's doing. And then another question is whether U.S. agencies like the Office of Refugee Resettlement are actively involved with any of the reintegration programs or should be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sure. So the office that was recently founded in June 2015 in El Salvador for the that is in charge of reintegration of adult deportees. That is, well, as I said, it's essentially a little too early to evaluate it, but the interviews have shown that they have three main areas of work. And just bear with me for a moment. One of them is entrepreneurship training. So they are going to invest $500,000 into training deportees in micro-entrepreneurship, and they hope to provide then seed capital for about 100 initiatives of deportees to start businesses. So that's one area of their work. Another one is easing access to education, both high school education and, in fact, higher education and vocational education. And the third area I'm blanking on currently, but you can find it in our report. It is actually mentioned in the appendix and described in more detail, including the full name of this new office. And about the second question, in how far the Office of Refugee Resettlement is involved with any of these programs, there are connections between U.S. agencies and the ORR in particular, to my knowledge, with the program that KIND is running for Guatemalan reintegration, for Guatemalan child reintegration, and in how far this should be the case. In fact, one of our findings is that there should be greater collaboration between the actors in the region, and that includes having a greater comprehensive accompaniment of both children and adults, and that means from the actual shelter, from the ORR shelter, all the way through the deportation process to the local communities of children. So yes, that would be desirable.
Thank you. Here's a question that I think goes to Rodrigo. Somebody asks, does Mexico have reciprocal agreements with the Northern Triangle countries similar to those that the U.S. has that structure the deportation process between the U.S. and Mexico and between the U.S. and the Northern Triangle? And are the reciprocal agreements followed? And how does that impact the reintegration process? And I'll also ask you, Rodrigo, to comment just a bit on sort of Mexico's enforcement role generally.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for both questions. On the first question, yes, there are cooperation agreements that have been signed by all the countries in the region and Mexico. The most important ones are the agreements for the deportation of children. And these are the ones that work better. So consular authorities from the government of the countries of origin, they participate in the whole deportation process in Mexico when the children are in Mexico. And their main role is to try to identify the family of the minor before the minor is deported from Mexico. In addition to that, buses that leave Mexico with children to Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, they're only sent on specific days and specific times, and the child protection agencies in the countries are informed of the times when the buses will arrive to the respective countries, and they also inform them of the list of the children who are going in those buses, so that the child protection agencies and the shelters in the countries of origin are ready to receive the children, and they inform their families, so their families can plan to go pick them up, and they try to facilitate the reception of children that way. So to sum up, yes, there are agreements, but the most important agreements are the agreements related to children, to the deportation of children. With about the second question, Marc, that you asked, about Mexico's increasing role in the region. So in part of as a response of the 2014 search on of children, but also even since before the 2014 search in children, Mexico had been establishing and changing their migration policies. In 2014, though, they started this new program called the Southern Border Program. And the Southern Border Program has, several aspects to it. Some of them include the protection, trying to increase some protection services inside of Mexico for migrants who are going through the country and who are detained. But the results that we are seeing in the increases of apprehensions and deportations of migrants from Mexico kind of show that the Southern Border Program has tilted a little bit more towards enforcement and increasing, surveillance and police presence in the southern border, so that less migrants can make it through all the way to the border with the U.S.
Great, thank you. So one question that we received, I'll just answer myself. The question is there a comprehensive list of the services available in each country? And I would refer you to the report. The report is pretty comprehensive in answering exactly that question. That's a pretty detailed appendix, and I know a lot of work went into it, and some work even went into reviewing it. So please take a look at it. And then we've gotten a couple of questions about what we know about the impact of these programs on the propensity to remigrate. So can we measure how successful the programs are at preventing remigration? And then also, do we know anything about what happens to children who do attempt to migrate again, whether they are subject to violence en route, how many of them are dying on these second chances, what information we have about remigration.
Mm-hmm. Rodrigo, if you're okay with it, I would go with the first question. So can we measure the success of these programs? And that really relates to this fourth challenge that I spoke about, which is that we have very little data available. There was no study done that compared, that had a control group, and where we, had one group that received the services, the other group that didn't receive the services, and then afterwards we checked what share of each group had remigrated. And that is one of the key issues here, that it is very difficult to measure how successful these programs are at actually preventing remigration. We have anecdotal evidence, some of which I mentioned earlier, for instance, the interviews with service providers in Honduras at the new reception center, who said that immediate remigration, so getting off the bus and immediately turning around, was massively decreased by the simple existence of a center there. Having said that, of course, a lot of people may, take the bus ticket and go back home, rest for a while, and then try and cross again a few weeks or months later. And that has been confirmed by interviews that I led in, especially in Guatemala, with a group of deportees who said, we will all go back, but it will just depend on when we will go back. And about the second question, what happens when they remigrate? I'm not sure that I'd be the best person to answer that, because my view on that would simply be, I think the dangers in remigration for a child and for any other migrant are not that dissimilar from the dangers that they would encounter the first time around. They may have some quote-unquote advantages, as in they know their smuggler, they know what to expect when they are apprehended, they have been detained before, so they are better, you could argue they're better prepared for it. Although, of course, the psychological damage that is done of being detained for a child, I don't think that is something you can properly prepare for. So that would be my 2 cents on that, but I'm happy to cede the floor to Marc or Rodrigo if they want to add.
Go ahead, Rodrigo.
To add to what Victoria said, I completely agree with what you said, Victoria. And to me, the question is a bit unclear whether they're targeted, you know, in their route through Mexico to try to reach the United States again, or not. But we do have, I mean, especially lately, there's been, you know, increased attention to try to follow up with what's happening to children who are migrating through Mexico, and there are journalistic reports about the dangerous situations that these children are going through when they're crossing through Mexico, and that, as Victoria said, doesn't change very much from the first time to the second time that they make it through. So protecting these children in their journey through Mexico is quite important, and we're actually gonna very soon release a report about Mexico's protection of children.
Rodrigo, on sort of a related note, we've also had a question about, and maybe you've spoken to this a bit, but a question about what's being done to target smugglers in particular. Or do you want to take that, Victoria, or Rodrigo?
Rodrigo, if you want to go ahead, please do. Otherwise, I have 2 cents that I could add.
That's a very good question, and I think I don't have a lot to say on this right now. Do you want to try to tackle that, Victoria?
Sure. So I think that smuggling is really a key piece in this whole puzzle, and disrupting these smart business models of smugglers is crucial. We've seen a few operations in the last years, law enforcement operations. For instance, in 2014, we saw Operation Coyote of DHS, and a little further south, we saw Operation Lucero between ICE and the law enforcement agencies in the Northern Triangle, and they have resulted in arrests of smugglers, in seizing of capital, in seizing of vehicles. So they have had some successes. But one thing that the field research that we did especially brought to light and emphasized is that the model of giving migrants 3 attempts to cross really decreases the threshold for remigration so much. So if you have already crossed and you are being deported, you have already paid your lump sum of between $5,000 and $9,000. So it would be not particularly rational to not try again. There is, of course, a cost associated to remigration, but that cost is humanitarian, and some migrants will be willing to weigh that cost less than they see the benefit of potentially making it across and potentially being able to repay their debt to their smuggler. So we also heard of some new trends in smuggling when we did the field research, for instance, that some smugglers apparently now allow children to transfer your 3 attempts to a sibling or to another family member. So in the case where there's family tension, which is also apparently common, of some siblings blaming their brothers or sisters for not making it across, then these siblings can actually hand over the tries to their siblings. So as long as these types of business models that constantly evolve and adapt to law enforcement operations, as long as they are there, we will have to struggle with this problem, and the operations I mentioned earlier are attempts, but we're really dealing with smugglers who are usually 2 steps ahead.
Great. Let me ask. We've gotten several questions about particular vulnerable populations, including teenage girls who are pregnant, who may be deported back, indigenous populations who are deported back, victims of trafficking. How are these vulnerable populations identified, and what kind of special support is available for them?
So I'm going to use the example of, for instance, the reception center for child deportees in Guatemala is called Casa Nuestras Raíces, and our field research looks particularly at the shelter that they have in Quetzaltenango. They also have one in Guatemala City. So the way it works there, for instance, is that there is a medical area that is available, and children, if they so choose, they can request to be taken to that area. It's a private room, and there they conduct the medical examination. What I was told by the people, by the leader of this shelter, is that often girls do not want to talk about the things that have happened and are very hesitant in talking about what has happened to them on the trip. So often they return with, urinary infections, and then when they are being examined, then they may open up and start talking about this. What is being done? How are they screened for also trafficking victims? The question also asked about that. In this shelter, interviews are conducted that try to assess, and these interviews are conducted by psychologists and social workers that try to assess the abuse and trauma of children. And in case that abuse and trauma is found, then efforts are made to connect the youth with follow-up services in their communities. Having said that, Rodrigo mentioned that the actual process in the center is relatively short. So for adults, it can be down to 30 minutes. For children, it's usually a little longer. But in the case of the shelter that I saw, a bus arrives of around between 30 and 35 people, and within 3 or 4 hours, usually, all the interviews have been conducted, all the handing over to family members has been conducted. So really, one could argue that there's not necessarily, or it is clear that there's not necessarily enough time to find these cases of abuse in every case.
And just quickly, are the shelters well equipped to handle indigenous populations, or the reception centers?
From what I've seen, I would confirm that. One interesting finding, though, that I heard about in Guatemala, where a majority of deported children hail from indigenous backgrounds, is, and that is interesting, that the discrimination against indigenous deportees actually exists even within the deportee population. So I was told about some instances where some deported teenagers refused to sleep next to indigenous teenagers that were also deported on the same buses, saying, we are better than them, why should we sleep next to them? So this just to give a sense of really these underlying prevailing discrimination that indigenous populations are facing, and that's of course not just limited to child deportation.
So we're running out of time. I want to ask, we've gotten a couple of questions about, additional questions about the role of government agencies, both U.S. and Central American government agencies, and what role they can play, are playing in creating a coordinating agency to improve and regulate the reintegration programs. What kind of capacity and interest is there on the part of the governments in the region, and what role are different U.S. Government agencies playing to support that?
Rodrigo, I'll start. Please jump in if you like. So I just say that on the U.S. side, I think I would say that there's clearly a role for financial engagement, and that financial engagement can happen, for instance, through U.S. aid. It is happening to some degree already and has happened in the past. And as we pointed out, it really is a crucial investment. These international investments, financial investments into these programs are crucial. A lot of them would simply not exist without this funding. Also, of course, the Alliance for Prosperity is an avenue through which the United States can make substantial investments into the region as a whole, and within that, into reintegration programs. And we are currently waiting to see what the actual levels of funding are going to be that Congress will make available for the Northern Triangle. We could have a decision soon, but that timeline is somewhat malleable. Mexico, on the other hand, I think there are other ways of engaging of what they could do concretely. For instance, Mexico definitely has a role in collaborating with Central America on the returning process. There's a greater consular network collaboration that could be useful. Mexico has a lot of experience with opening up networks in the United States for the protection of its nationals, and the idea is that Central America could do something similar in opening up more consulates in Mexico. So that's one avenue. And also, of course, Mexico has a long-standing experience with reintegrating a lot of Mexicans that were deported from the United States. So there could be value in a greater exchange between the countries on these experiences. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I would like to add some recent developments. So Mexico's Agency for International Cooperation, which is, the equivalent more or less to USAID, Mexico has been strengthening this agency in the past few years, and they have two specific mechanisms to collaborate with Central American countries. One is called the Mesoamerican Project, and actually both of them are part of the Mesoamerican Project. The project itself is the initiatives through which Mexico invests in infrastructure projects like highways, or recently they connected the electric grid in the whole region, saving the countries in Central America quite a bit of money in electric fees. And this has a fund called the Fund for Mesoamerica and the Caribbean, and that fund supports all these projects. However, there aren't funds specifically directed towards the reintegration of migrants or towards projects that have to do with migrants. And what we think should be done is migration should be included when thinking where should investments go through these mechanisms. And Mexico's Agency for International Cooperation can start, diverting these investments with the specific goals of trying to reintegrate deportees, but also to try to change the conditions in the countries of origin that are, forcing people, or that are making people take trips up to the United States.
Thank you. So we've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank everybody who gave us really excellent questions, and I apologize that there's a couple that we're not going to have time to answer. As you see on your screen, the slides and audio from the webinar are available on our website. The report is also available. For any reporters who are on the call, you can follow up with Michelle Middlestat, and you also have the contact information for me and Victoria and Rodrigo, and we're happy to be in touch with anybody whose question didn't get answered, or anybody who is interested in the research. Please feel free to be in touch directly with us. And with that, thank you all very much.